The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the city streets with a ferocity that matched Eleanor Hart's mood. She sat in the back seat of her sleek black town car, staring through the rain-smeared window at the blurred lights of the world she owned, but could never belong to. Her tailored dress clung to her, expensive yet stifling, a metaphor for her gilded cage. "Home, Miss Hart?" asked her driver, Greg, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "No," she said abruptly. "Drive around for a while." Greg knew better than to question her. The car glided through the wet streets, a fortress of leather and steel, cutting through the city's underbelly. As they passed a narrow alley, Eleanor's gaze caught something unusual. A figure huddled under a tattered blanket, a cardboard sign drooping from his knees. The words scrawled in black marker read, "Will work for food." "Stop," Eleanor said. "Ma'am?" Greg hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror. "I said stop," she repeated, her voice sharper. The car slowed to a halt. Eleanor stepped out, her designer heels splashing in a puddle. She approached the figure, her umbrella shielding her from the deluge. "Do you have a name?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rain. The man looked up, startled. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow yet piercing. "Daniel," he said after a pause, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her tone brisk. "Do you want a meal? A roof for the night?" Daniel's brow furrowed. "What's the catch?" "No catch," she said, though her mind buzzed with an unspoken agenda. Perhaps she sought redemption, or a distraction from her own emptiness. She wasn't sure. He hesitated but finally nodded. "All right." "Good," Eleanor said, signaling Greg to open the trunk. She handed Daniel a spare coat from the car and motioned him to climb in. The warmth of the vehicle enveloped them, a stark contrast to the icy rain outside. As they drove to her penthouse, neither spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken judgments and cautious curiosity. The sun rose sluggishly over the city, painting the skyline with muted hues of gold and gray. Eleanor sat at the head of her dining table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Across from her, Daniel sat stiffly, his eyes darting around the lavish apartment as though expecting someone to tell him he didn't belong. The night had passed uneventfully. Eleanor had shown him to a guest room, larger than most studio apartments, and left him with a towel, clean clothes, and a terse goodnight. Daniel, unused to such gestures of hospitality, had spent the night in restless contemplation. Now, in the soft light of morning, they faced each other for the first time without the rain as a barrier. "I'll get straight to the point," Eleanor began, setting her coffee down with a deliberate clink. "I want to help you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for help." "No, you didn't," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But you need it." "And I—" She hesitated, her next words catching in her throat. "I need something too." Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "And what exactly is that?" Eleanor exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "A break from the monotony. A chance to do something real. My life is all deals and numbers, faces I forget as soon as they leave the room. Helping you, it feels like it matters." Daniel's lips twitched into something between a smirk and a frown. "So, I'm your charity project." "Not exactly," she said sharply. "I'm offering you a chance to reset. You can stay here for a week, get cleaned up, eat properly, figure out your next steps. No strings attached." His eyes narrowed. "And what do you get out of it?" Eleanor hesitated. What did she get? Redemption? A distraction from her own emptiness? She didn't want to admit that she didn't know the answer. "Let's just call it a mutually beneficial arrangement," she said finally. Daniel snorted. "Sounds more like a rich woman's guilt trip." "Think what you want," Eleanor snapped, her carefully composed demeanor slipping for a moment. "But you've been on the streets long enough to know this isn't a common offer. Take it or leave it." Silence hung between them, heavy with tension. Finally, Daniel sighed. "Fine. 1 week." Eleanor nodded, masking her relief with a cool smile. Good. There's a spare room down the hall. Make yourself at home. Over the next few days, Daniel settled uneasily into the rhythms of Eleanor's world. He wore the clothes she provided, ate the meals her private chef prepared, and tried not to feel out of place amidst the opulence. Eleanor, for her part, kept her distance, observing him with a mix of curiosity and caution. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the spacious living room, Daniel finally broke the silence. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low but steady. "Why would you trust me in your home?" Eleanor looked up from her laptop, surprised. "I suppose I'm a good judge of character." He shook his head. "That's not it. People like you don't take risks unless there's a payoff." She closed her laptop and set it aside. "Maybe I'm not as predictable as you think. Or maybe you're just lonely," he said bluntly. Eleanor flinched but recovered quickly. "And maybe you're too proud to admit you needed help." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "I didn't need your help. I was surviving just fine." "Surviving isn't living," Eleanor shot back. The words hung in the air, striking a chord neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Daniel leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You're used to getting your way, aren't you?" he said finally. "Most of the time," she admitted, her lips quirking into a small, self-deprecating smile. "But you're not as easy to read as most people." "Guess that makes us even," Daniel said, his tone softening. For the first time, the tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative truce. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. By the end of the week, Eleanor found herself dreading Daniel's departure more than she cared to admit. He had become a quiet but steady presence in her life, challenging her in ways no one else dared. But true to his word, he began packing his few belongings as the week drew to a close. "Leaving already?" she asked casually as she passed by his room, though her tone betrayed her reluctance. "Your deal was 1 week," he said without looking up. "I'm not about to overstay my welcome." Eleanor hesitated, then stepped into the room. "You could stay longer, if you wanted." Daniel looked up, his eyes searching hers. "Why? What's in it for you?" For once, Eleanor didn't have an answer. She simply shrugged. "Does it matter?" Daniel considered her for a long moment before shaking his head. "I don't belong here, Eleanor. This isn't my world." "Maybe it could be," she said quietly. He sighed, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Thanks for everything, really. But I've got to figure things out on my own." And with that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the empty room, wondering why his absence felt heavier than it should. Eleanor paced the length of her penthouse, her designer heels clicking against the marble floors. Days had passed since Daniel's departure, but his presence lingered in her mind like a shadow. She had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, yet something about him had burrowed under her skin. The morning's unwelcome discovery only added to her disquiet. A faint wave of nausea had washed over her during breakfast, sending her rushing to the bathroom. At first, she dismissed it as stress, a minor inconvenience in her otherwise meticulously controlled life. But when it happened again the following day, she decided to see her doctor. Now, she sat on the edge of her seat in a sterile examination room, the walls painted a soothing beige that did little to calm her nerves. "Ms. Hart," the doctor said, entering the room with a clipboard in hand. Her face betrayed nothing, but Eleanor's stomach clenched at the gravity in her tone. "Just tell me," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than intended. The doctor hesitated before meeting her gaze. "You're pregnant," Eleanor blinked, the words landing like a punch to her chest. "That's impossible," she said, her voice hollow. "Not impossible," the doctor replied gently. "Unexpected, perhaps, but the results are clear." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, her carefully constructed world threatening to crumble. She left the clinic in a daze, her driver's concerned questions barely registering as she climbed into the car. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, nursing a glass of wine she didn't dare drink. Her mind raced with questions. How could this have happened? Her tryst with Daniel was a fleeting moment of vulnerability, an impulsive decision in the haze of a rainy night. She had never imagined it would lead to this. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her assistant, Jenna, checking in about an upcoming board meeting. Eleanor ignored it, the weight of her situation making the usual demands of her life feel trivial. She glanced at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the twinkling lights mocking her sense of control. For the first time in years, she felt utterly unmoored. Over the next few days, Eleanor threw herself into work, hoping to drown out the storm brewing inside her. But no matter how many meetings she attended or deals she closed, the reality of her pregnancy loomed over her like a dark cloud. One night, as she sifted through contracts in her study, a thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. Daniel. He had a right to know, but how could she even begin to find him? He had left no contact information, no trace of where he might go. She spent hours scrolling through online forums and outreach programs, her frustration mounting with every dead end. Finally, she turned to her personal investigator, a man discreetly employed by her company for sensitive matters. "I need you to find someone," she said, handing him a photo taken from her security footage. The investigator raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Consider it done." Weeks passed, and Eleanor's growing stomach became impossible to ignore. She avoided social events, citing work as an excuse, but the whispers among her colleagues grew louder. She felt like a stranger in her own life, her carefully curated existence unraveling with every passing day. One afternoon, her phone rang. It was the investigator. "I found him," he said simply. Eleanor's breath caught. "Where?" "An outreach center downtown. He's been volunteering there." Volunteering? The word jarred her. She couldn't reconcile it with the man she had met in the rain, his pride and anger masking a deeper pain. Without a second thought, she grabbed her coat and instructed her driver to take her there. Beka Patrol of the center was a modest building tucked between graffiti-streaked walls, a far cry from the gleaming towers Eleanor was accustomed to. She hesitated at the entrance, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The smell of coffee and cleaning supplies greeted her, along with the sound of muted conversations. A woman at the front desk smiled warmly. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," Eleanor said, her voice wavering slightly. "His name is Daniel." The woman's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of recognition. "He's in the back, sorting donations. I can take you to him." Eleanor nodded, following the woman down a narrow hallway. Her nerves tightened with each step, and when she finally saw him, her breath caught. Daniel was kneeling on the floor, folding clothes into neat piles. He looked healthier, his face no longer hollow, his movements purposeful. He glanced up as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Eleanor?" he said, rising to his feet. She nodded, her throat dry. "We need to talk." And they sat in a quiet corner of the center, the noise of the world fading into the background. "I don't know how to say this," Eleanor began, her voice trembling, "but I'm pregnant. And it's yours." Daniel stared at her, the words hanging in the air like a bombshell. "You're sure?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Yes," she said firmly. "I thought you deserved to know." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. This doesn't make sense. I mean, how—" "It happened," Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharp. "Now the question is, what do we do about it?" Daniel shook his head, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "I don't know. I barely have my own life together." How am I supposed to be a father? Eleanor felt a pang of anger rise in her chest. Do you think I planned this? I didn't exactly picture myself raising a child with a stranger. Daniel flinched, her words cutting deeper than she intended. I'm sorry, he said, after a long pause. I need time to process this. So do I, Eleanor admitted, her voice softening. But time isn't a luxury we have. They sat in silence, the enormity of their situation pressing down on them. For the first time, Eleanor saw the fear behind Daniel's tough exterior, mirroring her own. Despite their differences, they were bound together now, their lives forever intertwined. The air in the outreach center felt thick with tension as Eleanor left Daniel sitting alone in the corner, his head in his hands. The gravity of their conversation had settled heavily on them both, and she didn't press him for answers or commitments. She needed space to think, to recalibrate her own life, but most of all, she needed to understand the man who was now an irrevocable part of her future. The days following their encounter were a blur of restless nights and half-formed plans. Eleanor found herself consumed with a need to know more about Daniel. Who was he before life brought him to the streets? Why had someone with such sharp intelligence and quiet determination ended up in such a precarious position? Her first step was to call her investigator again. I need you to dig deeper into Daniel's background, she said firmly. I want to know everything, his family, his past jobs, what brought him to where he is now. The investigator, used to her unyielding determination, merely nodded. I'll get to work. A week later, Eleanor sat across from the investigator in her office as he laid a file on her desk. Daniel Carter, he began, 36 years old. He was a structural engineer for a reputable firm until about 3 years ago. Eleanor blinked. An engineer? Yes, the investigator confirmed. He was well regarded in his field, but things started to fall apart when his wife passed away. Eleanor leaned forward, her chest tightening. What happened? Car accident, he said quietly. It was sudden. By all accounts, they were deeply in love. Her death hit him hard. He fell into a deep depression, lost his job, and eventually his home. Eleanor sat back, processing the revelation. The image of Daniel folding clothes at the outreach center felt worlds away from the man in the report. A skilled professional, a loving husband, a man who had once had it all. Did he have any family? She asked. None that I could find, the investigator said. It seems his wife was his only close connection. Eleanor nodded, dismissing him with a quiet thanks. As she stared at the file, a wave of emotions swept over her. Sympathy, guilt, and an overwhelming desire to help him rebuild the life he had lost. Determined to bridge the growing gap between them, Eleanor returned to the outreach center, but Daniel wasn't there. She waited, pacing the narrow hallway, but as the hours passed, her frustration grew. Do you know where he is? She asked the receptionist, her tone sharper than she intended. The woman frowned. I think he mentioned heading to the park near Lincoln Avenue. He likes to walk there when he needs to think. Eleanor didn't waste a moment. She instructed her driver to take her to the park, her mind racing with thoughts of what she would say. She found him sitting on a bench near the edge of a pond, staring into the rippling water. You're hard to track down, she said, her voice carrying through the quiet. Daniel turned, startled. His expression softened when he saw her, though a flicker of hesitation remained in his eyes. Eleanor, what are you doing here? I needed to talk to you, she said, sitting beside him, and I thought you might need to talk to someone too. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been trying to figure out what to do, but nothing makes sense. Maybe it doesn't have to make sense, she said gently. Maybe we just have to take it one step at a time. He looked at her, his expression conflicted. You make it sound simple, but it's not. No, it's not, she agreed. But you're not alone in this, Daniel. I know it feels impossible, but I'm here. We'll figure it out together. For the first time, his defenses seemed to crack. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. Eleanor hesitated before reaching out, placing a hand on his. We start by trying. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor and Daniel began to spend more time together. She invited him to appointments with her doctor, subtly encouraging him to be part of the process. At first, he was hesitant, hovering on the edges of her life, as though afraid of overstepping. But as time passed, he began to open up. They talked about everything: his work as an engineer, his wife, and the years he had spent drifting after her death. Eleanor, in turn, shared pieces of her own story, revealing the loneliness beneath her polished exterior. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Daniel paused, looking down at her, thinking, "Why are you doing this, Eleanor? You don't owe me anything." She met his gaze, her expression earnest. "Because I want to, and because I think you deserve a chance to rebuild your life." He didn't respond immediately, but his silence carried a weight of gratitude he didn't yet know how to express. As Eleanor's due date approached, the fragile alliance between them began to solidify. Daniel took small steps to regain control of his life, enrolling in a job placement program and reconnecting with his engineering credentials. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself leaning on him more than she anticipated, his quiet strength becoming a source of comfort in her own uncertainty. One evening, as they sat in her living room, Daniel turned to her. "Do you think we can make this work? For the baby?" Eleanor looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "I think we have to try," she said softly. "For her, and for ourselves." For the first time, the enormity of their situation felt manageable. Together, they began to sketch a vision of the life they wanted to build, not perfect, but filled with hope. The months leading to Eleanor's due date were a whirlwind of change for both her and Daniel. Their lives, once so drastically different, began to intertwine in ways neither had anticipated. The tenuous connection they had forged during those initial conversations began to grow stronger, transforming into a partnership that held the potential to be something more. Daniel was no longer the man Eleanor had met in the rain-soaked alley. With her encouragement and a little behind-the-scenes influence from her powerful network, he had secured a part-time consulting position at a small engineering firm. Though it wasn't the high-profile career he once had, it was a start, and for Daniel, it was a lifeline. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said one evening, sitting across from Eleanor at her dining table. His hands were calloused from years of hardship, yet now they held a faint steadiness that hadn't been there before. "You don't need to thank me," Eleanor said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're doing this for yourself, Daniel. I'm just helping you see what you're capable of." Her words struck a chord. For years, Daniel had been haunted by the belief that he was irreparably broken, that his past mistakes had defined him. Now, with Eleanor's unwavering support, he began to see a flicker of hope. As Eleanor's belly grew, so did her determination to create a welcoming environment for her baby. She transformed one of her penthouse rooms into a nursery, filling it with soft colors and carefully chosen furnishings. But for all her wealth and resources, the process felt overwhelming. One afternoon, Daniel found her in the nursery, sitting amidst a pile of unopened boxes and instruction manuals. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, her expression equal parts exhaustion and frustration. "If I rest anymore, I'll go insane. Besides, I don't even know how half of this stuff works." Daniel chuckled and stepped inside. "Let me help." Over the next few hours, they assembled cribs, organized baby clothes, and navigated the maze of parenting guides Eleanor had purchased. For the first time, they laughed together, the tension that had defined their early interactions giving way to a surprising ease. As Daniel tightened the last bolt on the crib, he glanced at Eleanor, who was folding tiny onesies. I think we make a good team, he said, the words carrying more weight than he intended. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his. I think so too. While their private world began to take shape, the outside world wasn't as forgiving. Eleanor's pregnancy had sparked speculation among the media and her business associates, and whispers of scandal swirled around her name. She had always been fiercely private, but now her personal life was front-page news. At a charity gala she attended reluctantly, a reporter cornered her with a pointed question. Ms. Hart, the public is curious. Who's the father of your child? Eleanor's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Daniel appeared at her side, his presence grounding her. She doesn't owe you an explanation, Daniel said evenly, his calm voice carrying an authority that silenced the room. The reporter, startled, backed away, and Eleanor turned to Daniel, her gratitude shining through her composed exterior. Thank you, she whispered as they left the event together. Always, he replied. Despite the progress they had made, Eleanor and Daniel still struggled with the scars of their pasts. Late one night, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, their conversation turned introspective. Do you ever think about her? Eleanor asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel's gaze softened. Every day, he admitted. But it's different now. I'm not stuck in the past anymore. I'm learning to let go. Eleanor nodded, understanding his struggle more than she cared to admit. I think we all carry ghosts, she said. Mine just wear designer suits. Daniel chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. You've got a good sense of humor for someone who runs half the city. And you're surprisingly insightful for someone who pretended he didn't want my help, she shot back with a smirk. Their laughter echoed into the night, a small but significant sign of the trust they were building. As Eleanor's due date approached, Jenna, her loyal assistant, insisted on organizing a baby shower. Despite Eleanor's protests, the event turned out to be a surprisingly intimate affair, filled with close friends and a few of Daniel's newfound colleagues. For Daniel, the shower was another step toward normalcy, a reminder of the community he was slowly rebuilding. For Eleanor, it was a moment to appreciate how far they had come, not just as individuals, but as a team. As they opened gifts and shared stories, Eleanor caught Daniel's eye across the room. In that moment, she realized how much he had come to mean to her. He wasn't just the father of her child, he was her partner in this unexpected journey. Late that night, after the guests had left, Eleanor and Daniel sat in the nursery, surrounded by the trappings of their soon-to-arrive daughter. The room was quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. Do you think we're ready for this? Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Daniel reached out, placing a hand over hers. Probably not, he said honestly. But I think we'll figure it out. Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing the world alone. As they sat together, the bond between them grew stronger, the fragile bridge they had built transforming into something unshakable. The early hours of dawn painted the city skyline in shades of orange and pink, but the calm outside was a stark contrast to the chaos within Eleanor's penthouse. The labor pains had started just after midnight, and by sunrise, Eleanor was gripping Daniel's hand with a force that threatened to crush his fingers. Breathe, Eleanor, Daniel said, his voice strained as he tried to steady her through each contraction. I am breathing, she snapped, her face contorted in pain. Jenna, who had arrived minutes earlier, was pacing nervously by the door. The car's ready. Let's go, she urged, as though they were racing a clock. Hours later, Eleanor's screams gave way to the sound of a newborn's first cries. Tears filled her eyes as the doctor placed a tiny, wriggling bundle in her arms. Her daughter, with soft tufts of dark hair and an impossibly small face, was perfect. Daniel stood at her side, his expression a mix of awe and vulnerability. When Eleanor looked up at him, She saw something she hadn't expected. A man transformed. He wasn't the broken figure she had met months ago. He was steady, present, and undeniably devoted. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She is," Eleanor agreed, her heart swelling as their daughter's tiny fingers curled around her own. "Do you want to hold her?" Daniel hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. "What if I drop her?" "You won't," Eleanor said softly, placing the baby into his arms. The moment the child settled against him, Daniel's fear seemed to melt away. He held her as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world, his face alight with a mixture of love and disbelief. The first few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diapers. Despite Eleanor's meticulous planning, nothing could have prepared her for the chaos of caring for a newborn. She quickly learned that no amount of wealth or resources could replace the raw grit required to be a parent. Daniel became her anchor during those exhausting days. He took on late-night feedings, soothed their daughter's cries with surprising patience, and even managed to coax a rare laugh out of Eleanor during a particularly messy diaper change. "I think she's plotting against us," he joked one night as they sat on the couch, the baby finally asleep in her bassinet. Eleanor chuckled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "If she is, she's winning." As they settled into their new roles, the outside world began to intrude once more. Eleanor's absence from her company had sparked rumors among her board members, some questioning her ability to balance motherhood with her demanding career. Meanwhile, Daniel faced judgment from those who couldn't reconcile his homeless past with his current life. One evening, as they sat together after a long day, Daniel voiced his concerns. "Do you ever feel like people are waiting for us to fail?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the sleeping baby in his arms. Eleanor sighed, brushing a hand through her hair. "All the time. But they don't matter, Daniel. What matters is this: our family." Her words seemed to calm him, though the weight of their challenges lingered. Despite the obstacles, Eleanor and Daniel's partnership deepened. They learned to navigate the messy, beautiful chaos of parenthood together, their shared experiences forging a bond neither had anticipated. One afternoon, as they took their daughter for her first walk in the park, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how far they had come. The man beside her, once a stranger with a shadowed past, had become her closest confidant and partner in every sense of the word. "You've changed," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a great thing," she replied, her smile warm. "You've found yourself again." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You would have," she said softly, "but I'm glad I could help." As their daughter grew, so did Eleanor and Daniel's vision for their future. They began to discuss long-term plans, balancing Eleanor's demanding career with Daniel's budding return to engineering. Their conversations were filled with hope, their shared determination to create a stable, loving home for their child driving every decision. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the balcony, Daniel turned to Eleanor. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly, "about us, about what we've built together." She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" "I want to make it official," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flicker in his eyes. "I want us to be a family, not just for her, but for us too." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Daniel, are you—" "Yes," he interrupted, a smile breaking across his face. "I'm asking you to take a chance on me. On us." Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes." With their commitment to one another solidified, Eleanor and Daniel embraced their new life with renewed determination. The challenges they faced didn't disappear, but together they found the strength to overcome them. As they stood in their daughter's nursery that night, watching her sleep peacefully, Eleanor reached for Daniel's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "We have," he agreed, his voice filled with quiet pride. And for the first time in years, both of them felt whole. The next chapter of Eleanor and Daniel's lives began not with grand gestures or sweeping changes, but in the quiet, daily rhythms of parenthood and partnership. Their daughter, whom they had named Lila, became the heart of their growing family. Her giggles filled the once silent penthouse, and her tiny hands seemed to knit together the fractured pieces of their pasts. Eleanor returned to work after 3 months of maternity leave, determined to show her board members and the world that motherhood had not dulled her sharp mind or business acumen. The first day back was grueling. Balancing high-stakes negotiations while worrying about Lila's well-being at home stretched her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But she wasn't alone. Daniel had become a steady presence in her life, both as a partner and a co-parent. On Eleanor's first day back, he sent her a picture of Lila smiling in her bouncer with the caption, "We're rooting for you." The text made her laugh and cry in equal measure. Daniel, too, faced his own challenges as he continued rebuilding his career. His part-time consulting job had turned into a full-time offer, and while he relished the opportunity, he struggled with imposter syndrome. He worried that his past would always overshadow his future. "You've earned this, Daniel," Eleanor told him one night as they shared a quiet moment on the balcony. "Don't let anyone, including yourself, make you feel otherwise." Her words stayed with him, giving him the courage to take the next step in his career with confidence. When Lila turned 1, Eleanor and Daniel threw a small celebration at the outreach center where their journey had begun. It was a deliberate choice, a way to honor the place that had helped both of them during their lowest moments. The party was modest, attended by a mix of Eleanor's friends, Daniel's colleagues, and the volunteers who had supported him. Lila toddled around, clutching a balloon in one hand and giggling at the attention she received. During the festivities, Daniel pulled Eleanor aside. "You know, I think this might be the happiest I've ever been," he said, his voice filled with quiet amazement. Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "Me too." It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of all they had endured to reach this point. As their relationship became more visible, so did the scrutiny surrounding it. Eleanor's position as a high-profile businesswoman made her a target for gossip, and Daniel's past as a homeless man became fodder for sensational headlines. "From the streets to the boardroom, the scandalous life of Eleanor Hart," one tabloid blared. Eleanor was furious, but Daniel took it in stride. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know us." "I hate that they're trying to define you by your worst moments," she said. "Then let's prove them wrong," he replied with a determined smile. Instead of hiding, they decided to share their story in their own words. Eleanor gave a rare interview, not to defend their relationship, but to highlight the importance of second chances and the transformative power of support. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Letters poured in from people who had faced similar struggles, thanking Eleanor and Daniel for their honesty and courage. It was a reminder that their journey, though deeply personal, had the power to inspire others. As the years passed, Eleanor and Daniel found new definitions of success. For Eleanor, it was no longer about climbing higher on the corporate ladder, but about creating a legacy that would outlast her. She started a foundation focused on helping people rebuild their lives, inspired by Daniel's journey. Daniel, meanwhile, began mentoring young engineers, sharing not just his technical expertise, but also his life lessons. He found fulfillment in guiding others, showing them that failure didn't have to be the end of the story. Lila grew up in a home filled with love, her parents' commitment to each other serving as a constant source of stability. She was the glue that held their unconventional family together, her presence a daily reminder of the path they had walked to find one another. One crisp autumn evening, As they walked through the park where Eleanor had first gone searching for Daniel, he surprised her with a question. "Marry me," he said simply, holding her hand as they watched Lila chase falling leaves. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious," he said, his voice steady. "You've changed my life, Eleanor, and I don't want to spend another day without making it official." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes." There was no elaborate proposal, no grand announcement. It was quiet and intimate, just like their love, a partnership built on trust, resilience, and unwavering support. Their wedding was a small affair, held in the garden of their home, with Lila as their flower girl. It wasn't the opulent event Eleanor's peers might have expected, but it was perfect. Surrounded by those who had supported them through their journey, they vowed to continue building a life together. As they danced under the stars that night, Eleanor leaned her head against Daniel's chest, her heart full. "We've come a long way," she whispered. "We have," he agreed, holding her close. "And this is just the beginning." Years passed, and the life Eleanor and Daniel built together flourished. They had faced challenges that tested their strength, but through it all, their bond had only deepened. With their daughter Lila growing into a spirited, curious child, they found themselves navigating a new phase of life, one filled with joy, purpose, and reflection. Eleanor's foundation had grown into a cornerstone of her life's work. Its focus on supporting individuals in rebuilding their lives through education, job training, and housing initiatives had helped hundreds of people find stability. She often worked late into the night, pouring her heart into expanding its reach, but she no longer did it alone. Daniel became an integral part of the foundation, offering his unique perspective as someone who had lived through the struggles they aimed to address. His mentorship program for engineers flourished under the foundation's umbrella, connecting aspiring professionals with the guidance and support they needed to thrive. "You've made such a difference," Eleanor told him one evening as they reviewed the latest quarterly report. "You've given so many people hope." He smiled at her, his gaze steady. "You gave me hope first." Lila grew up surrounded by love and the example of resilience her parents set. She was a bright, inquisitive child with an insatiable curiosity about the world. At 6 years old, she announced that she wanted to be an inventor, a decision that thrilled Daniel. "An inventor, huh?" he said one afternoon as they worked on a science kit together. "What are you going to invent?" "Something that helps people," she said confidently, her small hands tinkering with a set of gears. "Like you and Mommy." Eleanor, watching from the doorway, felt her heart swell. Their daughter was not only a reflection of their love, but also a testament to the life they had worked so hard to create. For Daniel, the past still lingered in the form of memories and unresolved grief. On the anniversary of his late wife's death, he asked Eleanor if they could visit the place where he had first started over. "It feels like the right time," he explained, his voice filled with quiet determination. Eleanor supported him without hesitation. Together they traveled to the small town where he had last lived with his wife. Visiting the cemetery was an emotional experience, but it brought Daniel a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. "She would have liked you," he told Eleanor afterward, as they walked through the quiet streets. "You would have gotten along." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "She was a part of who you are, and I'm grateful for that. It led you here." For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to truly let go of the guilt he had carried for so long. While Daniel found closure, Eleanor faced her own reckoning. Her career, once the defining pillar of her life, had become less central as her family and foundation took precedence. When a lucrative offer came to expand her company overseas, she found herself at a crossroads. "What do you want to do?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat together in their living room, Lila asleep upstairs. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. Part of me wants to take it. It's everything I've worked for. But another part of me, I don't want to miss more moments with Lila. Or with you. Daniel took her hand, his touch grounding her. You've already proven yourself, Eleanor. You don't need to keep climbing to show the world what you're capable of. Do what makes you happy. His words resonated deeply. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to consider stepping back, not as a retreat, but as a choice to focus on what mattered most. Eleanor decided to remain local, delegating much of her business's expansion efforts to a trusted team. The decision freed her to spend more time with her family and foundation, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose in her work. As their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm, Eleanor and Daniel began discussing ways to deepen their commitment to the causes they cared about. They opened a community center in the heart of the city, offering free childcare, career training, and support services for families in need. It became a labor of love for both of them, a reflection of their shared vision for a better world. On Lila's 10th birthday, the family gathered in the park where Eleanor and Daniel had first reconnected. Surrounded by friends, family, and the community they had helped build, they celebrated not just their daughter's milestone, but the life they had created together. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Eleanor and Daniel stood hand in hand, watching Lila chase her friends through the grass. "We've come a long way," Eleanor said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Daniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the same awe. "And we've got so much more ahead of us." In that moment, they knew they had found not just redemption, but something even greater, a life defined by love, resilience, and the enduring strength of the bridges they had built together.